Thank you, Lindsay, and good evening, everyone. My name is John Franklin, and I serve as Executive Director of Imago. Imago's work is at the intersection of art, faith, and culture. And this year, it will celebrate its 50th anniversary. I want to welcome you to this evening event of the Relevant 2022. Many of you have been attending other sessions this week, and there are some of you who have come just for this evening. We're glad that you're here for the conversation as we explore the topic of art, faith, and human suffering. As Christians, organizers of this event, we believe that all land and all peoples were created by God. And we want to acknowledge that the land on which U of T lies is the traditional territory of the Wendat Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. We thank these First Peoples who continue to live on these lands and care for them, and whose relationships to these lands existed long before the founding of Canada. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. Now, as this evening is focused on themes of suffering and hope through the lens of the arts, particularly visual art, we want to begin by giving you an opportunity to view some artworks that speak to our theme. And I say speak because visual art, like words, is also a language. There are 12 images that will be on the screen for about 10 seconds each, and you will see the series through twice. And while that's happening, our guest pianist, Lindsay, will provide the art of music to enrich our experience of these images. But before we begin, I want to comment very briefly on 3 of these images, remembering that we're talking about suffering and hope. The first is by Canadian Group of 7 artist, A.Y. Jackson. This striking image of a night sky lit up by dazzling light at first gives the impression of a celebration, fireworks perhaps. But the title of the work, painted back in 1918, tells the somber reality. Gas attack at Louvain. Poisonous gas causing painful death to scores, even hundreds of people. And Jackson was one of many artists assigned to create a visual art record of World War I. The second image tells a story. Back in 1937, a small town in northern Spain was targeted for attack. The population did not support the policies of the government during the Spanish Civil War. Hitler's Air Force was assigned the task of bombing the town of Guernica. It was scheduled for late afternoon when the people would be in the streets, and the extended bombing of the civilians killed or injured over 1/3 of the population. All this over political differences. You see here Picasso's response, which becomes an icon to keep memory alive. And just so you have an idea, the painting is 3.5 meters by 8 meters. The third piece harkens back a few centuries. This is by Matthias Grunewald. It was painted in 1512 to 1516, and it was done for the Eisenheim Hospital of the Brothers of St. Anthony. St. Anthony, the patron saint of those suffering from skin diseases. Perhaps this particular painting is the most grotesque image of the crucifixion in Western art. It conveys the story that Jesus had suffered. And so the viewer at the Eisenheim Hospital is not alone in their suffering. I leave the rest of the images to your imagination, and we'll start the rotation now, and Lindsay, you will play for us as we watch. Thank you very much, Lindsay. And now for the next few minutes, I want us to reflect together about suffering and hope, and the awkward question of whether God cares about your pain. The most common challenge to the Christian faith is the presence of pain, evil, and suffering in the world. And we may ask, if there is a God, why is it that God allows these things? Let me make a distinction. There is a difference between the suffering we bring on ourselves and the suffering that happens to us. My attention this evening is more on the latter, the suffering that happens to us. Now, suffering is a timely topic, given that the world has for 2 years lived under the shadow of a pandemic that has brought so much suffering, pain, and death to our world. Included here is both physical suffering and emotional or psychological suffering. But beyond that, there is also the destruction brought on by climate change, fires and floods, economic hardships, and the ravages of war, poverty, and famine. It would seem that suffering is part of the condition of human existence. Our cultural narrative wishes to turn a blind eye to suffering. Oh, yes, it's there, but let's not give it too much attention. We prefer to think about human progress, economic benefit, and our own individual freedoms, and how technology will save us. We don't have a place for suffering in our modern narrative. Its presence makes us uncomfortable, even embarrassed. We want it to go away. Frankly, we can't make sense of it. When the Christian voice comes into the conversation, the frustration surfaces. Why doesn't God rid the world of suffering if you believe in God? That question reveals how we see suffering as an intruder, disrupting our efforts to manage the world on our own terms. Unfortunately, many Christians have adopted the spirit of the cultural narrative, and they proclaim a Christian faith that will deliver you from suffering in this life and set you on a path of happiness and triumph. I want to say quite categorically, this view is false. It's not what Christianity teaches, nor is it the way exemplified by its central figure, Jesus. The story of the passion of Jesus makes it clear that suffering is something to be embraced. And strangely, death is required for life to flourish. A grain of wheat must die in order to bring forth new growth. If you read the Psalms, suffering is a common theme. If we look at the lives of the apostles, suffering shows up again and again. The call to be kingdom people is a call to take up your cross, uncomfortable though that may be. Now, there is no suggestion here that we need to go looking for opportunities to suffer, but neither should we expect that suffering will be absent from our lives. Some suffering, it seems, is woven into life in ways that we cannot either predict or control. Of course, life also includes joy and peace and hope, but more about hope in a moment. Two questions that are before us. One is the question of whether God cares about my pain, and the other is, how do we find room for hope in our experience of suffering? First, does God care about my pain? Well, the answer to that question is yes. God does care about your pain, but perhaps not in the way you would like. We're inclined to think that if God cared about our pain, God would keep us pain-free. We see it as a problem to be fixed, and fixed right away. But in the larger picture of the Christian faith, divine care has a different look. The broken relationship between humanity and God, and the pain and suffering that plagues our world as a result, has a long-term solution, not a quick fix. God's response to human suffering is not done from a remote location. No, God actually comes into the world of suffering and pain and participates in what we experience. The Apostle Paul expresses this story in a poetic way when he writes in his letter to the Philippians, speaking of Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be exploited or grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So God's care about our pain is manifest in the divine gesture of taking on the form of a servant, being born in human likeness, and obediently walking a path towards death, even death on the cross. That was the journey of Jesus. We turn now to our second question. How do suffering and hope come together? Well, once we let go of the idea of avoiding suffering completely or a quick fix for our pain and suffering, we can set our sights on another horizon. In the liturgy and services of the early church, crucifixion and resurrection were in close relationship, sometimes referred to as an indivisible mystery. Crucifixion and resurrection are intimately connected. The suffering of crucifixion and the hope found in resurrection stand side by side. And I think this is instructive for us all as to how we are to respond to the dark and difficult world in which we live and the pain and suffering that is all around us and indeed within us. We acknowledge its presence, but we deny its victory. It is not the last word about how things are. Suffering does not tell us this is just the way it is, and that's an end to it. The resurrection of Jesus is the first glimpse that we have concerning the promise that one day all things will be made new. Let me say that again, that the resurrection of Jesus is the first glimpse that we have concerning the promise that one day all things will be made new. In the light of this story, we're able to set our sights on another horizon, confident that humanity that now needs to face the darkness and the pain, its struggle and conflict, will one day be free from all of that. And even the creation, now groaning and travailing and waiting for the day of redemption, will likewise one day be made new. In our culture, we are told to live in the moment, focus on the present. However, attention only to the present limits our vision and cramps our imagination. Christian faith has a different suggestion. First, engage memory of things past, particularly the memory of the biblical narrative, which offers a story to live by. Secondly, we're invited to engage hope, attend to possibilities, to see what might be. That's an eye to the future. I know it's difficult to be asked to wait, especially in a culture of instant gratification. Waiting should be part of any spiritual journey, I believe. However, waiting need not be an idle and unproductive waiting. Gestures of care and compassion, generous sharing of our resources, advocating for justice, comforting the suffering. These and much more are ways we can bring into the present glimpses of what is yet to come. By doing these things, we practice hope right through our actions, and we provide some healing for our pain and suffering. And so I conclude that in this way by asking you a question. Which story will you choose to live in? Which story best captures reality? The cultural story that wants to ignore suffering and get on with managing the world? Or the Christian story that is willing to embrace suffering and to be sustained by the hope that all things will be made new? In these next 3 to 4 minutes, I'm going to just say a little bit about crossings. I'm very grateful for the invitation, Power to Change, and particularly Rebecca Louis-Saint, who invited me to participate in this evening. And it's in the context of crossings that we came up with this theme of suffering and hope. Does God care about my pain? Crossings is a Toronto version of a series of international exhibitions that began back in 2016. The first one was in London, and then I believe it went to Washington, D.C., then to New York, then to Amsterdam, then it was online, and we had to postpone a year, and we're now going to do this coming Lent, March the 2nd to April the 14th. And what Crossings is an opportunity to look at art, particularly visual art. It can be paintings or sculptures or collages or photography that engage the various stations of the cross. Now, the stations of the cross have a long history. When people wanted to go to Jerusalem to walk the path that Jesus walked way back in the Middle Ages, but that was very expensive. So one of the things that happened was that they began to have artists create either sculptures or paintings of the various stations of the cross, so you could actually walk the stations in your own local church. And what the stations of the cross do is invite you into the passion of Jesus. And these artworks that we're having done, and we have 16 stations, there's normally 14, but we've added Triumphal Entry, Palm Sunday, and Resurrection. So we have 16, and they're going to be placed in various locations on the university campus and at 5 churches up in the Yonge and St. Clair area. And people will have the opportunity to do a pilgrimage, as it were, to walk the stations of the cross. And when you do that, you're invited into the story of Jesus in an empathetic way, a way in which you sort of try to enter into the emotion of the time and what Jesus was going through. And when you think of the stations of the cross, there's so much there about unjust judgment, vulnerability, a kind of misuse of power, an oppressive misuse of power. And then, of course, there's suffering. But at the heart of it all, it's a story of redemption. But I would want to say that it's not just a religious story. It is a religious story, profoundly so. And I think one of the most influential stories in the Western culture, and indeed in the world. But it's a human story. And I think that whether you're a person of faith or of no faith, or if you're a seeker, or you're just interested in spirituality, or perhaps just interested in art, this is something that you could come to see. And we hope that large numbers of people are going to take advantage of this when it starts on March the 2nd. And I want to say that this is not just an opportunity for devotion, it is that, but it's also an opportunity to be moved by the story and by the artwork to action. Very much at the heart of this story is a kind of call to a socially responsible response. What are we going to do to make the world different? With the oppression, for example, that is experienced by First Nations, with gender issues, with economic oppression, with people who are suffering because of illness and so on, the poor, the marginalized. This is part of the call of the gospel, and it's part of the call of the Stations of the Cross. So let me just say that I hope that all of you, and those you know, will take the opportunity to come, not just to see this exhibit in its various locations, but to engage with it in a way that would have the potential to be life-transforming for each of you. Well, so much about crossings. We're now going to turn to, what shall I say, the centerpiece of the evening. And that's where we have opportunity to have conversation with 3 of the artists who are doing work for the Crossings exhibit. And I'm very pleased that with us this evening, Ruthia Pak Regis, Maria Gabankova, and James Paterson. My introductions are very brief. I've known Maria for a number of years, and she's a former professor at at OCAD, Ontario College of Art and Design, where she taught in the area of figure painting. James has been doing art of one kind or another for many years. And as I think I know that you left teaching at one point in order to follow this calling. And Ruthia, you've been painting, you do landscape. And your assignment in this Crossings project was a little different, the Women of Jerusalem. But you've been painting for, I think it's about 20 years or so. Yes? Okay. So let's begin our conversation. And what I want to ask you folks, maybe I'll begin with Ruthia, and then go to Maria, and then to James. I want to ask you to say something about your own experience of suffering and hope, and how those two things might have met in one way or another in your own creative life as an artist. So Ruthia, can you respond to that?
Sure. Am I trying to get this in 1 minute? Like I'm
no, you can have a little more.
Okay. 2 minutes, okay. I think actually it's funny looking back at the way art has, or making art or painting and drawing has had an impact on the way I see the world, understand myself. And painting has actually allowed me to slow down enough and pay attention to God, the world, myself. And one of the things that came up was that I actually didn't know I was suffering so much when I was younger. Yeah, so, okay, I'm just gonna get straight to the painting, where I think it was maybe about 8 years ago or so. I was going through a really hard time. I was really mad for whatever reason at my husband. And I started painting. I'm not an emotional painter, but I started painting. And there was some kind of beauty in the paint strokes that were made with that anger. And that got my attention. So I was like, okay. So in the midst of that suffering, I was able to still see beauty and lean into that, not ignore the suffering, which, you know, went away, of course, was always coming and going. But that allowed me to really slow down. And maybe I should have done this in a different order. If we can look at the most horizontal painting, the third of the three that I've given. So then, yeah, that one. So this is a few years old, and you can see that the shadows are just as present as the lit up portions of the landscape. And for me, for a long time, the shape of shadows and the quality of shadows and what that might represent in my soul and in my faith journey, the darkness, things unknown, potential fear, it just allowed me to keep seeing more and more beauty. And if you go to the one right before that, that painting is more recent with the little red spots, but you can still see the very, excuse me, the very dark space. And I know it's a little ambiguous, or at least I think it is, could be a little ambiguous for the viewer as a space that might offer an invitation to something that might be comfort or something that might be foreboding. But I think the call to engage that within the viewer, within yourself as you look at a painting like this is important. Yeah, and then the next, the square one with the trees and the path. This is also just from a couple of years ago, or maybe last year. Anyway, I don't remember, but I've never been into things that look super pretty, even though I admire that in other people's work. But for myself, it, I guess it's a thing for me to try and find the beauty in places that may not necessarily be pretty or photogenic or just picture perfect. But this is actually based on a scene in Assisi where St. Francis lived. So it's meaningful in that sense too, in terms of location. And I think something in art that I continue to learn is the quiet spaces I need to give it, the time of rest, the time of just sitting with an openness, rather than plowing through and getting those brush marks down and finishing the project. But that's the way I was living my life as a young person. And if there was pain or suffering, you just meet it head on. And I was like, I just need to get through it, plow through it, which actually was not the best, because that meant I was ignoring the suffering, probably missing out on a bunch of beauty, potential beauty that was in there. And so what I've come to learn actually through the painting process, which interestingly really mimics my soul, was to give it space and then move forward with what I've learned in the space. Of the space of prayer.
Ruthia, I clearly, I think from what you say, beauty for you has had some kind of healing effect, I think. And so you've turned to beauty as a place of solace and comfort. That seems to be the case.
No, really. Some people go to wine. I go to this. I mean,
that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Let's Maria. Can you say a little bit? You've been painting over many years and have done a wide variety of things. Talk to us a little bit. Oh, that's James. Have I done you in the wrong order here? Okay, go ahead, Maria.
First of all, I just want to mention that I basically grew up in a family of artists, and my parents taught me a lot and supported me in my love for art. And but at the beginning, I thought like that's what I love, that I want to do this. But I came in my early 20s, I experienced a sort of a real crisis, existential and emotional crisis, which led to basically losing meaning of my life. And out of that, so that was definitely a deep suffering that almost, I kind of wanted basically to end my life. I had no idea about direction or what to do, and I was longing for something and I didn't know what. But my parents, both Christians, believers, they helped me. They basically told me, both artists, and they both loved art, and they told me how they came to find Christ. And so anyway, I did then start seeking, and out of that crisis, I came to actually sort of at the bottom, at the dead-end street, and from that, I came to find faith and actually found meaning. So I'm mentioning that because the whole theme of suffering, and that out of that actually can come meaning, which is like so important, I think, in any human life. Without that, we are lost. And that doesn't mean that as believers, Christians, that we cannot experience again some other suffering or crisis. But in this painting here, this is a painting and a collage, and it actually started as a painting of Lazarus, a figure, a symbol, and a figure that I wanted to show somehow that strange stage of someone who has died and yet will come back to life, which is sort of what I feel like I experienced when I, accepted the Lord. And then in the end, and gradually, so I love to work from observation, looking and getting to know God's creation and the world through actually looking and taking time to look, not just taking a photograph. So this was a mannequin that I had wrapped up. So it was an installation. And then in the end, I added up these newspapers, which that's why it's called Forgotten News, because I wanted to show how you can see that it was done a few years back when there was still printed newspaper. So then it's sitting on these newspapers that we tend to forget. We're bombarded by so much information that we almost don't feel, and we forget very quickly, as we hear, especially now, about so many terrible things happening in ecology or politics and threats of war and pandemic and everything. So that also the box as a symbol of, you know, being imprisoned, and yet the top of that box is slightly opened. So it kind of suggests that the coming to life. And my next painting is, if we can see that, yeah, that's called Kosovo. And I had a live model for that. I've always loved to work with drawing from people or painting that, you know, expressing the invisible, which is, and part of that is, you know, with the facial expressions or the body language, to express the inner being, the character, the soul of the person. And I had a model for this that you can maybe see on top of it, Kosovo. So this idea was, I had seen a lot of the footage from the terrible wars that were in the mid-90s in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia, so Kosovo. And I had a model, and it was a very interesting cooperation working with her and discussing that, the idea of how to express the sorrow, you know, and sadness, and that the red drapery expressing passion, and us, you know, feeling for the empathy for the people that had to suffer through something like that.
Okay, Maria, we need to move on to James, but
okay.
we can look at another one of yours in a moment if we have time.
Okay.
But I'm very struck by your saying how meaning comes out of crisis.
Mm.
Meaning can come out of suffering when so often we think it's meaningless. My goodness. Anyway, James, there's your work. Away you go, James. You're muted.
First of all, thank you very much for including me in this. I feel very privileged to be part of it, and also, by extension, part of the Crossings exhibition. In leading up to this panel discussion tonight, I was thinking a lot about it, not really sure in some ways what suffering is, because, you know, I guess on the spectrum, it can range from dealing with some small or, you know, doubts that you have yourself about something to, you know, being totally displaced as a person from where you live and the country you live in. So there's a, you know, very wide spectrum. Feel very grateful that I've always, you know, living where we live here in the West and in Canada, we live good lives for the most part. And I don't think suffering as such has been something that's, you know, been a big part of my life when I look in the news and see what other people worldwide are going through. Just briefly though, with regards to my art, I had a wonderful experience in 2008 to 2011 where my wife and I and two of our children were in Germany at a Christian boarding school. We took a break from our regular lives and from the art that I was doing, and we were dorm parents for 3 years at this boarding school. And I had a bit of a crisis there myself, where I was dealing with my identity, who I was, what I was doing. And then in the midst of it all, sort of felt I'd lost the ability to pray, the ability to talk to God, to hear his voice in response. And if anything, I guess for me, I was feeling I was suffering then, feeling very cast adrift. And I began to think to myself, I'm more visual than verbal. What would my prayers look like? And I began playing with bits of wire and sticking them in blocks of wood and developing shapes, and had them sort of looking like ambiguous machines of sorts. And as I was going through that process, both the stress of working at this boarding school and being a dorm parent with 15, 20 teenage daughters in the middle of the Black Forest, it was with long dark winters, I found my prayer life returned as I was playing with the wire and creating these little sculptural objects. And so I called them prayer machines, and then began as an artist to develop them into art pieces. And so in that way, you know, relating to tonight's discussion, the process of my art was what led me out of this crisis or bump in the road or suffering, whatever you'd want to call it, something that I went through that was very profound for me at the time. Since then, I've developed them into much more sophisticated art pieces that I've, the last 10 years now, been doing completely. Most of my painting career, I worked as a painter, but after this experience in Germany and then returning to Canada in 2011, I've only been creating this wire sculpture ever since. What I tried to do with it for the most part is, I guess, just show people God's redemptive nature. I think that's the underlying story in the work that I do. I want to, rather than, I'm just saying for myself, in the art world, I've always seen a lot of very dark art. I've seen a lot of art that deals with the artist's suffering and emotional struggles, or like with Guernica, something more political and social, which a lot of art is. And I just felt with my voice, I wanted to speak of joy, of delight, of the hope that's coming, the hope of all things being made new, the hope of the future. And so in my work, I try and do that. And as you can see, if Terry, if you want to move on to some of the other pictures, even they're sort of self-explanatory in many ways. I give them titles that sort of express something I'm praying about or thinking about. And for the most part, the pieces, like this piece in particular, is a moving piece. There's a little crank down in the middle of that pink magenta wheel, and then the other wheels move around, and the face and profile in the background moves up and down. And I just want, people's faces light up when they see them and when they see them come to life. And a big part of my art too is to be able to touch it. You have to engage with it. You have to hold on to the crank, to turn it, to make it go. And I guess I'm just really looking at rather than looking at my suffering or other people's suffering, not that there isn't compassion involved or a coming alongside, rather, maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's with my work, I want to come alongside people wherever they're at, whether they're suffering, whether in the midst of great joy. I want to come along beside them and say, here, this expresses, this can express what you're thinking, what you're doing. And I've certainly had that feedback from people, people when they do see the pieces, it shows. They just, they light up, they delight in them.
We're running out of time.
I'm done.
I think there's a question. Is there a question? Oh, okay. It says that if God, Jesus, is the way to cope with suffering for Christians, does the Christian God also care to help those who are of other religions, faiths, and even atheists? You're on mute, James.
Are you asking me that specifically?
No, I'm saying that's the question, and we're just about out of time. I would say we're all God's children, and He cares a lot. He cares for all of us, regardless of what faith or religion that we've adhered to. Yeah. This is not a case of simply having dividing walls between people.
No.
The story of Jesus is a story that has application to everyone. Faith or no faith, and so it's a good and challenging question, but our time is gone. So I think we need to turn to other things. Thank you, each one of you, the panelists.
Thank you.
We're going to have an opportunity later to, I hope, to have further conversation and questions from folks out there. So once again, I'm going to, folks, give you Slido instructions. Go to the slido.com, type in the code relevant if you haven't done that already, and then type and send your questions. And then you have the opportunity to upvote the question. So if there's a question or two that you really like, then you can vote for it. And if it gets a lot of votes, then it'll probably make it close to the top. All right, so I'd like you to do that. And now, just before we conclude, a few things. Alpha. Alpha is an interactive series which engages people in conversations about the Christian faith. And the people who are leaders in this community are going to be offering a series of sessions focused on questions of life, faith, and meaning. the kinds of things we've been talking about tonight in a way. Each session will include time to connect, to watch a talk on video, and to share any thoughts or questions that you have. So that's what happens in an alpha meeting. And the invitation here is join us. They're meeting online starting on January 25th. And if you're interested or would like to receive more information about it, that you're asked to please fill out the follow-up form that's in the chat room. I hope it's there by now. There's the code, is it? The follow-up form, you simply say that you're interested to participate and would like someone maybe to be in touch with you. We'd love to hear your feedback. Stay connected with you if you have any more questions or want to know anything more. All right, so final words here. Oh, that's the alpha. Oh, okay. Okay, well, our time is nearly done. I want to just say a little bit about how we would like you to be involved in Crossings as we conclude. We would be very glad to have you get involved in Crossings, and there are 3 ways to do that. Let me just speak those ways now. You could walk the exhibit on your own or with friends when it starts March the 2nd. You could volunteer. We need tour guides or station hosts for key times during the exhibit. So run from March 2nd to April 14th and maybe a bit beyond. Or, and this one is really important, you could simply help us reach our missional goals by following up and promoting us on your social channels. We'd be very grateful if you would do that. How do you find us? Well, hashtag Crossings Toronto, or go to crossingstoronto.com. However you choose to engage, we're happy to have your support. So the 3 areas are attend, volunteer, share. crossingstoronto.com. If you go there, there will be a place for you to say that you'd like to participate, and you can be in touch with our project manager. Her name is Lisa Kember, and there'll be a link for you to be in touch with her if you go to the Crossings website. Or you can go to hashtag Crossings Toronto as well.